A woman who spends her life whispering eventually begins to believe she deserves silence. The laughter began softly at first, hidden behind crystal glasses and jeweled fans, but in the grand dining hall of Hale Manor, even quiet cruelty carried like thunder beneath the chandeliers. Vivian Hale kept her eyes lowered as the silver serving spoon trembled slightly in her gloved hand. Candlelight flickered across the long mahogany table where 30 guests dined beneath towering portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to stare down at her failures with painted judgment. Outside, freezing rain battered the tall windows of the estate, the wind howling across the dark countryside like something lonely searching for shelter. "Careful, Vivian," her mother said sharply, not bothering to hide the irritation in her voice. "Must you shake like a frightened child in front of our guests?" Heat flooded Vivian's cheeks at once. "I apologize," she whispered. The apology came automatically now. It had become as natural as breathing. Across the table, her older sister Clarissa sighed dramatically before lifting her wine glass. "Honestly, Mother, perhaps we should stop asking Vivian to serve at family gatherings. She looks as though she's about to faint every time someone speaks to her." Several guests chuckled politely. Vivian lowered her gaze further. The soup bowls blurred slightly before her eyes, though she blinked quickly to steady herself. One did not cry publicly at Hale Manor, especially not over words. Her father dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin before speaking in the cold, measured tone that had ruled the household her entire life. A lady who cannot conduct herself with grace should at least learn invisibility. More laughter followed, softer this time, sharper somehow. Vivian's fingers tightened around the silver tray until the edges bit against her palms beneath the gloves. She told herself not to react, not to breathe too quickly, not to let them see the humiliation rising in her throat. Because humiliation only invited more attention, and attention had never been safe for her. At the far end of the table, Duke Cedric Ashbourne remained silent. The most powerful man in the room sat beside the fireplace in a perfectly tailored black coat, one hand resting against the arm of his chair, while amber firelight cast shadows across the sharp lines of his face. Unlike the others, he had not laughed once that evening. In truth, he had barely spoken at all since arriving an hour earlier through the storm. Rumors claimed the Duke despised social gatherings. Others claimed he despised people in general. Vivian had never met him before tonight, though she knew his reputation well enough. Cold, untouchable, dangerous in the quiet way winter ice was dangerous. Yet she felt his eyes on her now. Not mocking, simply watching. The realization unsettled her far more than the laughter had. "Vivian," her mother's voice sliced through the silence again. "The Duke asked for tea nearly 5 minutes ago." "Of course." Vivian moved quickly toward the silver tea service near the center of the table. The room felt unbearably warm despite the storm outside. Her pulse fluttered painfully beneath her ribs as she reached for the porcelain cup. "Do not spill. Do not shake. Do not embarrass yourself again." But the moment she lifted the teapot, Clarissa leaned back in her chair with an amused smile. "Careful, Your Grace," she said lightly to Cedric. "My sister becomes terribly nervous whenever someone actually looks at her." Laughter burst around the table once more. Vivian's hand jerked. A single drop of tea splashed onto the white linen cloth between them. Silence followed instantly. Her mother inhaled sharply in horror. Vivian, just her name, but spoken with enough disappointment to hollow out her chest completely. I'm sorry." The words barely emerged above a whisper. She reached for a napkin with trembling fingers, but before she could touch the spill, another hand moved calmly across the table. Duke Cedric Ashbourne placed his gloved hand over the stained linen and looked directly at her for the first time that evening. His gray eyes were steady as winter skies. "It is only tea," he said quietly. The room fell still. Vivian forgot to breathe. No one spoke after the Duke defended her. The crackling fire seemed suddenly louder inside the enormous dining hall, its golden light flickering against crystal chandeliers and polished silver, while every guest avoided looking directly at Vivian Hale. Her mother recovered first. She forced a strained smile onto her painted lips and lifted her wineglass with brittle elegance. "Of course, Your Grace," she said softly. "My daughter has always been overly sensitive. We merely try to prepare her for society." Cedric Ashbourne did not remove his gaze from Vivian. "Society," he said evenly. would improve considerably if people learned when silence was more graceful than cruelty. The words landed gently, yet the room stiffened beneath them. Clarissa lowered her eyes at once. Vivian felt her pulse stumble painfully inside her chest. No one had ever spoken for her before. Not once. The realization frightened her more than humiliation ever had. Dinner resumed soon afterward, though conversation never fully recovered. Guests spoke in cautious murmurs while rain continued striking the tall windows overlooking the dark estate grounds. Vivian kept her attention fixed on refilling glasses and replacing silverware, desperate not to draw further notice. Yet every few moments she felt the Duke watching her from the end of the table with that same unreadable stillness. It unsettled her deeply. Men like Cedric Ashbourne did not notice women like her. Certainly not twice in one evening. When dessert was finally served, her mother dismissed her with quiet sharpness disguised as politeness. "You may leave now, Vivian. I believe you have embarrassed yourself enough for one night." The words were spoken softly enough that only those nearest could hear. Still, humiliation burned across Vivian's skin like fever. She lowered her head immediately. "Yes, mother." She turned toward the servant entrance at the far side of the hall, careful to keep her steps measured despite the trembling weakness in her legs. The moment the heavy doors closed behind her, the warmth of the dining hall disappeared entirely. The back corridor of Hale Manor stretched long and dim before her, lit only by a few struggling candles mounted against stone walls. Rain tapped softly against narrow windows overlooking the empty gardens outside. Vivian pressed one shaking hand against her ribs and finally allowed herself a slow breath. She had almost reached the staircase when a deep voice behind her stopped her cold. "Miss Hale." She froze instantly. No one had ever used her name with such calm precision before. Slowly, she turned. Duke Cedric Ashbourne stood several feet away beneath the flickering candlelight, his dark coat still buttoned against the storm outside. Without the noise of the dining hall surrounding him, his presence felt even more imposing somehow. Quiet, controlled, dangerous in ways she could not explain. Vivian lowered her eyes immediately. "Your Grace." Cedric studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Why do you apologize every time someone else is cruel to you?" Her breath caught painfully. The question struck something buried deep inside her chest, something she had spent years teaching herself not to feel. "I do not understand." "You apologized for spilling tea." His voice remained calm. "Yet half the people in that room seemed far guiltier than you." Vivian looked down at her hands. "It is easier this way." Cedric's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not pity. Something quieter. Something far more dangerous. Understanding. The corridor fell silent except for distant thunder rolling beyond the manor walls. Vivian became painfully aware of how alone they were standing there among shadows and candlelight. "Tell me something honestly," Cedric said at last. "When was the last time someone in this house listened when you spoke?" She opened her mouth automatically, ready with another apology, another polite excuse, another small lie designed to protect everyone except herself. But no words came, because she realized with sudden horror that she could not remember. The silence between them stretched so long that Vivian could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock somewhere deeper within Hale Manor. Rain continued sliding down the narrow corridor windows in silver streams, while candle flames trembled softly against the stone walls. Duke Cedric Ashbourne waited without impatience, his expression unreadable beneath the low golden light. He did not repeat the question. Somehow, that made it worse. Vivian lowered her eyes toward the floor, struggling to steady the sudden ache rising inside her chest. "People listen," she said quietly at last. "When what I say matters." Even to her own ears, the words sounded fragile. Practiced. Like something repeated too many times until it became easier to believe than question. Cedric remained still for a moment before asking softly, "And has anyone ever allowed it to matter?" Her throat tightened instantly. Vivian looked away toward the rain-swept darkness outside the windows. Childhood memories flickered through her mind like shadows cast by candlelight. Her father interrupting her halfway through every sentence. Clarissa laughing whenever she spoke too quickly from excitement. Her mother correcting the tone of her voice more often than the words themselves. "Softer, Vivian. Slower, Vivian." Ladies do not draw attention to themselves. Over time, silence had simply become safer. Easier. Lonelier. I should return to the dining hall, she whispered. Mother dislikes when I disappear too long. Cedric's gaze lingered on her trembling hands before he spoke again. You are afraid of disappointing people who do not seem troubled by disappointing you. The quiet truth of the statement struck harder than cruelty ever could. Vivian inhaled unevenly. No one had ever spoken aloud the things she spent years burying beneath politeness and obedience. It felt strangely unbearable. Your Grace, she said carefully, you should not concern yourself with me. Yet here I am. His voice remained calm, but something beneath it unsettled her deeply. Not fascination, not amusement. Attention, real attention. The kind she had spent her entire life avoiding because she had never learned what to do with it once she received it. Thunder rolled softly outside the manor. Somewhere downstairs, distant laughter echoed faintly from the dining hall, though it sounded far away now, as though another world existed beyond this dim corridor. Cedric stepped slightly closer, though still proper in every way. When you entered the room tonight, he said quietly, you looked as though you expected everyone to dislike you before you had even spoken. Vivian's breath caught. People often do. Why? She gave a small, uncertain shake of her head. I have never been particularly accomplished. No, Cedric's gray eyes held hers steadily now. You have simply been surrounded by people determined to convince you that you are small. The words settled heavily between them. Vivian felt something dangerous stir beneath years of carefully controlled silence. Not confidence. Not yet. But anger perhaps. Grief. The painful realization that she could no longer tell whether her quietness belonged naturally to her or had merely been forced upon her for so long that it became part of her soul. She looked down quickly, frightened by the thought itself. You should not say such things. Why? Because if I begin believing them, her voice faltered softly. Cedric's expression changed then, very slightly, yet enough for warmth to break through the cold restraint he carried like armor. Then perhaps, he said quietly, you would finally understand that there was never anything wrong with your voice at all. Vivian stared at him in stunned silence. Somewhere behind them, the heavy dining hall doors suddenly opened. Clarissa's sharp voice echoed down the corridor at once. There you are. Mother has been searching everywhere. Vivian stepped backward immediately, panic flashing across her face as the fragile stillness between her and Cedric shattered beneath the return of reality. But before she could lower her eyes again, the Duke spoke one final time in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear. Miss Hale, he said softly, the saddest thing in this house is not that no one listens to you. His gaze held her steadily. It is that you have begun believing you deserve it. The rest of the evening passed like a dream Vivian could not fully wake from. She moved through Hale Manor beneath the weight of candlelight and whispered conversation, replacing empty glasses and collecting silver trays, while Cedric Ashbourne's words echoed relentlessly inside her mind. There was never anything wrong with your voice at all. The thought frightened her more than she wished to admit. Because if he was right, then every quiet apology she had offered throughout her life suddenly felt unbearably tragic. Near midnight, the final guests departed into the freezing rain. Carriage wheels rattled across wet stone outside, while servants extinguished chandeliers one by one until shadows swallowed the enormous dining hall. Vivian stood near the entrance gathering abandoned gloves and folded shawls when her mother approached at last. Eleanor Hale's expression remained perfectly composed, though cold irritation sharpened every elegant feature of her face. What exactly possessed you tonight? She asked quietly. Vivian looked down immediately. I did not mean to cause trouble. And yet somehow you always do. Her mother adjusted one of her pearl bracelets with precise annoyance. The Duke likely pitied your awkwardness. Do not mistake politeness for interest. Vivian swallowed softly. Yes, mother. You embarrassed this family enough already. I expect better tomorrow evening at the Winter Conservatory recital. Fear flickered instantly through Vivian's chest. Tomorrow. Eleanor's gaze narrowed. Do not tell me you forgot. Of course, she had not forgotten. She had simply prayed the event might somehow be cancelled by weather or illness or divine mercy. Every winter, the Hale family hosted a private recital attended by prominent members of society. Clarissa always performed flawlessly before the guests while Vivian remained invisible in the background where she belonged. But this year Clarissa had fallen ill earlier that week with a lingering cough, which meant there was no one else left to play. Mother, Vivian whispered carefully. Perhaps we could postpone until Clarissa recovers. Absolutely not. Eleanor's voice hardened at once. Half the city's nobility will attend, including the Duke. Vivian's pulse stumbled. Your Grace is returning? He accepted your father's invitation before dinner ended. Eleanor's eyes sharpened slightly as she studied her daughter's expression. Which means tomorrow night you will sit at that piano and manage not to humiliate yourself. Again, the fear rising inside Vivian felt immediate and suffocating. Memories flooded her mind without warning. Missed notes beneath glaring candlelight. Guests exchanging embarrassed looks. Her father's disappointment afterward. Clarissa laughing softly behind closed doors. Music had once been the only thing Vivian loved without fear. As a child, she used to sneak into the east parlor before sunrise to play quietly while the rest of the house still slept. Those mornings had felt peaceful, safe somehow, until one disastrous recital at 14 years old when nervousness caused her hands to tremble before an audience. Her father had stopped the performance halfway through and escorted her from the room while guests whispered behind silk fans. Afterward, she had barely touched the piano for nearly a year. "Mother," she said softly now, "I do not think I can." Eleanor Hale stepped closer, lowering her voice into something cold enough to chill the air between them. "You can and you will. For once in your life, stop behaving like a frightened child." Vivian lowered her eyes immediately. The familiar shame wrapped around her chest like iron chains. "Yes, mother." Eleanor turned away with visible irritation. "Be ready by 7 tomorrow evening." And Vivian. She paused near the staircase beneath the dim chandelier light. "Do try not to shake this time." Long after her mother disappeared upstairs, Vivian remained standing alone in the darkened hall while rain whispered softly against the windows. Her hands trembled at her sides despite every effort to steady them. Upstairs, somewhere beyond the silence of Hale Manor, a grandfather clock struck midnight. And for the first time in years, Vivian found herself wondering what might happen if Duke Cedric Ashbourne witnessed her fail. Snow began falling shortly after dawn. Thick white flakes drifted past the tall windows of Hale Manor while the servants hurried through the corridors preparing for the evening recital. By afternoon, the entire estate smelled faintly of pine garlands, candle wax, and fresh roses imported from the city despite the brutal winter weather outside. Vivian stood alone in the east parlor, staring at the piano positioned beneath the enormous crystal chandelier. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the polished black surface of the instrument. Pale, nervous, fragile in a silver-gray gown chosen by her mother because it was elegant enough not to embarrass the family, yet plain enough not to draw attention from Clarissa. "Sit properly." Eleanor Hale circled behind her daughter with sharp-eyed precision. "Your shoulders tense whenever you are anxious." Vivian adjusted instantly. "Yes, mother. And do not rush the final movement this time. Last year was painful enough to endure once." Heat flooded Vivian's cheeks. She lowered her gaze toward the piano keys while guests' voices drifted faintly through the distant ballroom downstairs. More carriages continued arriving despite the storm. Nobles wrapped in fur-lined coats and velvet cloaks filled the manor with glittering conversation and polite laughter. Somewhere among them was Cedric Ashbourne. The thought unsettled her pulse immediately. Clarissa would have handled this beautifully. Eleanor continued while adjusting the lace sleeve of Vivian's gown with visible dissatisfaction. "Unfortunately, we must work with what we have." Vivian swallowed softly. "I will do my best." "Your best is not what concerns me." Her mother stepped back with cool elegance. "What concerns me is avoiding humiliation." The parlor doors opened suddenly before Vivian could respond. A servant bowed respectfully. "Your Grace has arrived." Vivian's breath caught at once. Footsteps echoed softly against marble floors outside the parlor, while distant conversation lowered almost instinctively. Duke Cedric Ashbourne entered the room carrying winter itself around him somehow. Snow clung faintly to the shoulders of his black coat, while candlelight flickered across sharp features made colder by the storm outside. Yet his gray eyes found Vivian immediately. Always immediately. It unsettled her more each time. Eleanor Hale's expression transformed at once into practiced warmth. "Your Grace, what an honor." Cedric greeted her politely before his gaze returned to Vivian standing beside the piano. "Miss Hale." Her fingers tightened slightly against the folds of her gown. "Your Grace." Silence flickered briefly between them beneath the golden light. Vivian became painfully aware of every small movement she made, the trembling of her hands, the nervous rise and fall of her breathing, the terrible awareness that he seemed to notice all of it. "We are delighted you could attend despite the weather," Eleanor said smoothly. "My daughter will be performing shortly." Cedric's expression remained unreadable. "Will she?" Vivian lowered her eyes instantly. Something about the question felt dangerous, as though he understood exactly how little choice she had been given. More guests entered the parlor over the next several minutes until the room filled with low conversation and rustling silk gowns. Musicians tuned violins near the fireplace while servants lit additional candles against the growing darkness outside. Snowstorm winds rattled faintly against the tall windows overlooking the frozen gardens. Then Eleanor finally turned toward her daughter with sharp expectation in her eyes. "Vivian." Every conversation seemed to quiet at once. Vivian's pulse thundered painfully inside her chest as she crossed toward the piano beneath dozens of watching eyes. She sat carefully upon the velvet bench, smoothing trembling fingers against her skirt before placing them lightly over the ivory keys. The room blurred slightly around the edges. "Breathe slowly. Do not shake. Do not fail." Yet the moment she glanced upward, her eyes collided with Cedric's across the crowded parlor. He stood near the fireplace, entirely still among the other guests, watching her not with amusement or pity, but with something infinitely worse. Belief. The terrifying possibility that he expected her to succeed. Vivian's hands trembled harder at once. The first note rang through the room soft as falling snow. Then the second, beautiful, fragile, for one impossible moment. The music flowed exactly as it once had during those secret childhood mornings before sunrise when no one listened closely enough to judge her. But then someone laughed quietly near the back of the room. Just once. Barely audible. Still, panic seized her. Instantly, her fingers slipped against the keys. A sharp, wrong note shattered through the parlor like broken glass. And suddenly, every fear she had buried for years came rushing back all at once. The wrong note lingered in the air long after the sound itself disappeared. Vivian froze before the piano, her trembling fingers still resting against the ivory keys, while humiliation spread through her chest with suffocating heat. The room had gone painfully still. Somewhere near the windows, someone cleared their throat awkwardly. Another guest shifted in discomfort. Vivian could already feel it happening. The pity, the embarrassment, the quiet relief that they were not the ones sitting beneath the chandelier with every eye fixed upon them. Her breathing became shallow instantly. She could not move, could not think. Childhood memories crashed over her in merciless waves. The recital at 14. Her father stopping the music midway through the performance. Clarissa whispering afterward that even the servants played with steadier hands. The weeks spent hiding from guests because she could not bear hearing the word unfortunate spoken with forced politeness ever again. "Vivian," her mother said sharply from across the room. The warning inside her voice cut deeper than anger. "Do not disgrace us further." Vivian lowered her head at once. "I am sorry." The apology emerged automatically. Small, fragile, exactly what everyone expected from her. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One older woman near the fireplace gave Vivian a look of careful sympathy that somehow felt worse than mockery. Sympathy implied failure had already become inevitable. Vivian's vision blurred faintly. She should stand, curtsy politely, leave the room before the humiliation worsened. That was what she had always done. Quiet exits, quiet tears, quiet shame. But before she could rise from the velvet bench, another voice interrupted the silence. "No." The single word cut through the parlor with calm authority. Every head turned immediately toward Cedric Ashbourne. The Duke remained standing near the fireplace, one gloved hand resting lightly against the marble mantel while snowstorm. Winds rattled faintly against the windows behind him. His expression revealed nothing. Yet the room shifted subtly beneath his attention. Even Eleanor Hale straightened slightly. Cedric's gaze never left Vivian. "You do not apologize for one wrong note," he said evenly. The warmth from the candles flickered softly across his sharp features as he crossed the room with measured steps. Slow enough to command attention, quiet enough to make everyone listen. Vivian's pulse stumbled painfully as he stopped beside the piano. "Your Grace," Eleanor began with strained politeness. "My daughter is simply nervous." Cedric finally looked toward her mother. Then perhaps, he said calmly. She should have been taught encouragement instead of fear. Silence crashed through the room once more. Eleanor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. No one spoke. No one dared. Vivian stared down at her hands, certain her heart would break through her ribs entirely. The Duke's defense should not have mattered this much. Yet somehow his words reached places inside her long buried beneath years of silence and obedience. Cedric turned slightly toward the piano. Continue, Miss Hale. Panic flickered instantly through her chest. I cannot. You can. His voice remained low enough that only those nearest could hear clearly. You simply believe every mistake deserves punishment. Vivian's throat tightened painfully. Because he was right. Dear God, he was right. She looked up at him for the first time since the music stopped. What if I fail again? For a moment, something softened behind Cedric's gray eyes. Not pity. Never pity. Understanding perhaps. Or recognition. As though he knew exactly what it meant to fear being seen too clearly. Then, he said quietly, you will still survive it. The words settled over her like warmth against winter cold. Around them, the entire parlor remained silent beneath candlelight and falling snow. Waiting. Watching. Vivian inhaled slowly. Her fingers trembled as they returned once more to the piano keys. But this time, when she began to play again, she noticed something strange. The fear was still there. Yet beneath it now existed something else. Something fragile. Dangerous. Hope. The second attempt began so quietly that several guests leaned forward without realizing it. Vivian kept her eyes lowered toward the piano keys while her fingers moved carefully through the opening melody, each note trembling slightly, like candlelight struggling against the winter wind outside. Yet this time, she did not stop. Fear still coiled tightly inside her chest, but Cedric Ashbourne's words remained steady beneath the panic like unseen hands holding her above dark water. You will still survive it. The realization felt almost foreign. All her life, mistakes had seemed catastrophic. A misplaced word. A wrong note. A moment of nervousness. Everything became proof that she was inadequate. Unworthy. Difficult to love. But now, beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and the endless whisper of falling snow beyond the windows, Vivian played through the fear instead of surrendering to it. The melody slowly deepened, filling the parlor with something fragile and aching. Guests who moments earlier exchanged embarrassed glances now sat motionless in their velvet chairs. Even the musicians near the fireplace lowered their instruments completely. The music was not flawless. A few notes still trembled uncertainly beneath her fingertips. Yet there was honesty inside it now. Loneliness. Hope. Years of swallowed emotion hidden beneath practiced silence. Cedric stood beside the piano without moving, his gray eyes fixed entirely on Vivian as though the rest of the room had disappeared. And perhaps for him, it had. Because somewhere between the first broken note and the second attempt, he realized something dangerous. The quiet woman everyone dismissed possessed more courage than half the people surrounding her. It took no strength to speak loudly in rooms designed to praise you. But to continue after humiliation? To keep playing while your hands still shook from fear? That required a different kind of bravery entirely. Across the parlor, Eleanor Hale's expression grew increasingly strained as guests listened with growing attention. She had expected pity at best, embarrassment at worst, not this unbearable silence thick with emotion. Clarissa sat stiffly near the windows, clearly unsettled by the shift in the room she could not control. Then Vivian reached the final movement. Her pulse fluttered painfully. This was always the section she feared most. Faster, more exposed. One mistake here could destroy the fragile calm she had rebuilt. Her fingers hesitated slightly above the keys. Panic surged again. The old terror returned instantly. They are waiting for you to fail. But then she heard it. Not laughter. Not whispers. Silence. Complete silence. No one in the room mocked her now. No one interrupted. And when Vivian risked one brief glance upward, she found Cedric watching her with quiet certainty instead of doubt. Somehow, that steadied her more than confidence ever could. She drew a careful breath and began the final passage. The music rose stronger this time, flowing through the candlelit parlor with startling clarity. Snowstorm winds howled softly outside the windows while the chandelier light shimmered across polished ivory keys beneath her hands. And for the first time in years, Vivian stopped trying to disappear. The final note faded slowly into silence. Real silence this time. Deep, breathless, the kind that exists only after something beautiful has wounded the heart. No one moved. Vivian's chest rose unevenly as she stared down at the piano, suddenly terrified by what she had done. Then applause shattered through the room all at once. Startled gasps followed as guests rose from their chairs, praising the performance with genuine admiration. Vivian froze completely. She had prepared herself for humiliation. Never this. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked toward the crowd in disbelief. Several women near the fireplace wiped discreetly at their eyes. Even the older musicians nodded with quiet approval. But through all the applause, Vivian noticed only one person. Cedric Ashbourne had not clapped immediately. He simply stood beside her beneath the golden chandelier light, looking at her as though he had just witnessed something rare enough to leave him momentarily speechless. And somehow, that affected her more than all the applause combined. The applause continued longer than Vivian knew how to endure. Guests surrounded her almost immediately beneath the glow of the crystal chandelier, offering praise that felt strangely unreal after a lifetime spent unnoticed. Beautifully done. Such feeling in the final movement. Why have we never heard you perform before? Each compliment landed against her heart with painful unfamiliarity. Vivian smiled politely because she did not know what else to do, yet confusion lingered behind every breath. These were the same people who had ignored her moments earlier, the same voices that once drifted past her like cold wine through empty halls. Now they looked directly at her. Listen when she spoke. It felt less like triumph and more like stepping into sunlight after years underground. Across the room, Eleanor Hale accepted the compliments with carefully controlled grace, though tension sharpened the corners of her smile each time another guest praised Vivian instead of Clarissa. My daughter has always been musically inclined, she said smoothly to a group near the fireplace, as though encouragement rather than criticism had shaped tonight's performance. Vivian lowered her gaze at once. The old instinct returned immediately. Stay quiet. Do not create conflict. But before guilt could fully settle over her again, a servant approached carrying a silver tray. A message for Miss Hale. Confused murmurs spread quietly among nearby guests as the servant handed Vivian a folded ivory card sealed with dark wax. Her pulse fluttered softly the moment she recognized the crest pressed into the seal. Ashbourne. Vivian carefully opened the note with trembling fingers. The handwriting was precise and unmistakably masculine. You played as though your soul had finally grown tired of hiding. For a moment, the noise of the parlor faded entirely. Vivian stared at the words while warmth spread slowly through her chest in ways both terrifying and impossible to ignore. No one had ever described her with such understanding before. Not accomplished, not proper, not obedient. Seen. She looked up instinctively across the crowded room. Cedric Ashbourne stood near the tall windows, overlooking the snow-covered gardens, one hand resting behind his back, while candlelight flickered softly against the sharp line of his jaw. Their eyes met instantly, as though he had been watching her all along. Vivian's breath caught painfully. The Duke inclined his head only slightly before turning toward another nobleman speaking beside him. Yet the brief acknowledgement unsettled her more than grand gestures ever could. What is that? Clarissa's voice appeared suddenly beside her shoulder. Vivian startled softly and folded the note at once. Nothing. Clarissa's eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. A message? Before Vivian could respond, Eleanor Hale approached them both with dangerous calm hidden beneath practiced elegance. Guests are beginning to depart, she announced quietly. Vivian, thank the Duke personally before he leaves. It would appear he has taken an unusual interest in tonight's performance. The words sounded polite enough for nearby company. Yet Vivian heard the warning beneath them clearly. Be careful. Do not presume too much. Do not embarrass us again. Vivian lowered her eyes immediately. Yes, mother. Nearly half an hour passed before she gathered enough courage to approach Cedric near the entrance hall. Snowstorm winds moaned softly outside the towering front doors while servants helped guests into heavy winter coats and fur-lined gloves. Cedric stood apart from the crowd somehow, even among dozens of nobles. Still, controlled, untouchable, until he looked at her. Then something in his expression always shifted. Your Grace, Vivian said quietly. Cedric turned fully toward her. Miss Hale. She clutched the folded note carefully in her gloved hands. Thank you for your kindness this evening. Kindness. A faint shadow of amusement touched his features. I merely listened. The simplicity of the statement stole her breath again, because listening itself had always felt extraordinary where she was concerned. Vivian looked down briefly before whispering, "Most people do not." Silence flickered softly between them beneath the golden candlelight. Then Cedric stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice enough that the bustling entrance hall faded around them. "That," he said quietly, "is their failure, not yours." Vivian's heart tightened painfully at the words. Outside, snow continued falling across the dark world beyond Hale Manor. But for the first time in years, something inside her no longer felt entirely frozen. For 3 days after the recital, Hale Manor spoke of little else. Visitors arrived each afternoon beneath gray winter skies, carrying invitations, compliments, and carefully disguised curiosity about the quiet Hale daughter who had suddenly become the subject of society's attention. Vivian moved through the manor in a strange daze, unable to understand how one evening could alter the atmosphere around her so completely. Servants smiled more warmly now. Guests greeted her first instead of overlooking her entirely. Even strangers in town paused to compliment her performance when the family carriage passed through the snowy streets of Blackthorn Village. Yet inside Hale Manor itself, little truly changed. Clarissa remained distant and sharp-tongued whenever they were alone, while Eleanor Hale grew increasingly tense each time another invitation arrived addressed specifically to Vivian rather than the family as a whole. People lose interest quickly, her mother remarked coldly one afternoon while sorting correspondence near the library fire. Do not allow temporary attention to fill your head with unrealistic ideas. Vivian lowered her eyes automatically. Yes, mother. Yet the words no longer settled inside her the way they once had. Because somewhere beneath years of silence, something had begun quietly awakening. Confidence, perhaps, or simply exhaustion from believing she deserved less than kindness. That same evening, heavy snow blanketed the estate grounds while candlelight flickered softly through the manor corridors. Vivian sat alone in the library long after midnight, curled near the fireplace with a book resting unopened in her lap. Her thoughts drifted endlessly towards Cedric Ashbourne despite every effort to stop them. The Duke had not returned to Hale Manor since the recital. Yet his words lingered everywhere somehow. In every room. Every silence. Every uncertain breath she took. A sudden knock interrupted the stillness. Vivian startled softly before setting the book aside. Come in. The library door opened slowly, revealing not a servant but her father. Richard Hale rarely entered the library at night. He stood stiffly near the doorway, one hand clasped behind his back, while firelight cast long shadows across his severe expression. Vivian rose immediately. Father, sit. His voice remained calm, though never warm. Vivian obeyed at once, nervousness tightening inside her chest. Richard Hale approached the fireplace slowly before speaking again. You received another invitation today. Yes, sir. From the Duchess of Whitmore. Vivian nodded carefully. She requested a musical performance during her winter gathering. Her father's expression darkened faintly. And you declined. Vivian looked down at her hands. I did not wish to overstep. Silence stretched heavily between them. Then Richard Hale said quietly, Your mother informed me the Duke of Ashbourne specifically recommended you to the Duchess. Vivian's breath caught softly. She had not known that. Heat spread faintly through her chest despite herself. Cedric had spoken of her again. Her father studied her expression carefully, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Do not misunderstand the situation, Vivian. The warmth vanished instantly. Men like Cedric Ashbourne find novelty entertaining. Nothing more. Vivian lowered her gaze immediately. I understand. Do you? His voice hardened slightly. Because your behavior lately suggests otherwise. You are quieter than usual. Distracted. Hopeful. The final word landed almost like criticism. Vivian swallowed painfully. I never intended to disappoint anyone. That is precisely the problem. Richard Hale stepped closer to the fire, staring into the flames rather than at his daughter. You have spent your life seeking approval from people who do not have time to indulge weakness. Vivian felt the familiar ache return to her chest. Small again. Fragile again. Yet before she could apologize, her father spoke once more in a quieter tone than she had ever heard from him. Do You know why your mother corrected you so harshly as a child. Vivian looked up uncertainly. Richard Hale's expression remained distant beneath the firelight. Because when you were 8 years old, you stood during a dinner party and told a table full of noblemen they frightened you. Shame flooded her instantly. She remembered it now. The laughter afterward. Her mother's humiliation. You cried in front of 40 guests, her father continued coldly. After that evening, your mother decided softness needed to be disciplined out of you before society destroyed you entirely. Vivian stared at him in stunned silence, while something inside her slowly cracked apart. Not protection. Never protection. Fear. They had silenced her because her vulnerability embarrassed them. The realization hollowed her chest with terrible clarity. Richard Hale finally turned toward her. Cedric Ashbourne may tolerate softness, he said quietly. The world will not. Then he left her alone beside the dying fire, while snow continued falling endlessly beyond the dark library windows. The next invitation arrived sealed in black wax bearing the crest of Ashbourne Manor itself. Vivian stared at the envelope for several long seconds before daring to open it. Outside the breakfast room windows, the storm from the previous night had softened into gentle snowfall, drifting across the frozen gardens in pale morning light. Clarissa sat across from her sipping tea while Eleanor Hale sorted correspondence with careful precision. Neither woman noticed the slight tremor in Vivian's hands as she unfolded the letter. Miss Vivian Hale, the Duke of Ashbourne requests the honor of your presence at the midwinter charity ball this Saturday evening. A carriage will arrive promptly at 7 o'clock. Vivian's breath caught softly. Cedric himself had invited her. Not the family. Her. What is it? Eleanor asked sharply. Vivian hesitated only a moment before handing over the letter. Silence settled heavily across the breakfast room as Eleanor read the invitation twice. Clarissa lowered her teacup slowly, disbelief flashing openly across her face. The Duke invited Vivian? The words sounded almost absurd spoken aloud. Eleanor's expression hardened immediately. This is highly irregular. Yet beneath her disapproval flickered something unmistakable. Calculation. Because regardless of personal feelings, an invitation from Cedric Ashbourne could not be refused. Not by anyone in Blackthorn County. You will attend, Eleanor said finally while folding the letter with measured calm. Vivian blinked softly. Mother, you heard me. Her mother's sharp gaze settled upon her daughter with renewed scrutiny. And this time, you will conduct yourself carefully. The Duke's attention has already encouraged enough gossip. Clarissa gave a quiet laugh lacking warmth. Perhaps His Grace enjoys rescuing frightened creatures. Vivian lowered her eyes at once, though the words stung less than they once might have. Because somewhere deep inside, she no longer fully believed cruelty simply because it was spoken confidently. Saturday evening arrived beneath silver skies and falling snow. Ashbourne Manor stood nearly 30 miles beyond Blackthorn Village atop a ridge overlooking frozen forests and dark winter hills. As the Hale carriage approached the estate through swirling snow, Vivian felt her breath catch despite herself. The manor looked less like a home and more like something from an old Gothic painting. Towering stone walls wrapped in ivy. Golden windows glowing warmly against the storm-dark landscape. Iron gates standing open beneath lantern light while carriages lined the long circular drive one after another. Music drifted faintly through the winter air the moment the carriage stopped. Remember yourself tonight, Eleanor murmured sharply before the footman opened the door. Vivian nodded quietly. Yes, Mother. The grand ballroom inside Ashbourne Manor shimmered beneath hundreds of candles reflected through crystal chandeliers and towering mirrors framed in gold. Noble guests filled the room in rich velvet and glittering jewels, while an orchestra played softly near the marble staircase. Yet despite the beauty surrounding her, Vivian felt painfully out of place the moment she entered. Conversations slowed subtly around her. Curious glances followed. Whispers drifted behind silk fans. That is her, the girl from the recital. Cedric Ashbourne's attention had transformed her into something dangerous within society. Noticeable. Vivian's pulse fluttered nervously beneath the pale blue gown Eleanor selected specifically because it looked elegant without appearing ambitious. She stayed close beside her family while guests greeted them politely. Then suddenly the atmosphere shifted. Not loudly, simply completely. Conversations quieted near the staircase. Several guests stepped subtly aside, and Vivian knew before even turning toward the entrance who had arrived. Cedric Ashbourne descended the grand staircase, slowly beneath the golden chandelier light, dressed entirely in black except for the silver watch chain glinting faintly against his waistcoat. Yet it was not his appearance that silenced the room. It was the way his gaze moved immediately through dozens of guests until finding Vivian without hesitation. The rest of society seemed to disappear for one unbearable moment. Vivian forgot how to breathe entirely as Cedric crossed the ballroom toward her with calm certainty. Clarissa stiffened beside her. Eleanor's fingers tightened subtly around her wine glass. But Cedric stopped directly before Vivian alone. "Miss Hale." His voice remained low and steady beneath the music. Vivian lowered her eyes automatically. "Your Grace." Silence flickered softly between them while snowstorm winds whispered faintly against the ballroom windows. Then Cedric extended his gloved hand toward her in front of the entire room. "Would you honor me with the first dance?" Shock rippled visibly across nearby guests, because every person present understood exactly what the gesture meant. A duke did not publicly choose the invisible daughter. For one suspended moment, the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing with her. Vivian stared at Cedric Ashbourne's outstretched hand while the orchestra fell gradually silent beneath the towering chandeliers. Around them, nobles exchanged stunned glances behind crystal glasses and jeweled fans. A duke could have chosen any woman in the room for the opening dance. Wealthy heiresses, celebrated beauties, daughters of powerful families. Yet Cedric Ashbourne stood before the quiet girl society barely noticed a month ago. Vivian felt her pulse trembling violently beneath her ribs. "Your Grace," Eleanor Hale said quickly, recovering before anyone else. "Surely there are ladies here far more suitable for the honor." Cedric did not look away from Vivian. "I disagree." The calm certainty in his voice silenced the room further. Clarissa's expression tightened visibly while nearby guests pretended not to stare. Vivian's fingers curled nervously against the folds of her pale blue gown. Fear rose instantly inside her chest. Not fear of Cedric. Never him. Fear of being seen too clearly, too publicly. Her entire life, attention had arrived hand in hand with humiliation. Yet Cedric waited without impatience, his hand remaining extended toward her beneath the golden candlelight. Not demanding, simply offering. The difference nearly broke her heart. Slowly, Vivian placed her trembling hand into his gloved one. A quiet murmur spread across the ballroom immediately. Cedric's fingers closed gently around hers before he guided her toward the center of the marble floor. The orchestra resumed softly at once, violins filling the vast room with slow, elegant music while hundreds of eyes followed them. Vivian's breath felt painfully shallow as Cedric rested one careful hand against her waist. Proper, respectful, yet the warmth of his touch still unsettled every guarded corner of her heart. "You are frightened," he said quietly as they began to dance. Vivian lowered her eyes. "Everyone is watching. Let them." The simple answer startled her enough to glance up at him. Cedric's gray eyes remained steady beneath the ballroom light. "You spend too much time fearing people who have not earned such power over you." Vivian swallowed softly. "It is difficult not to. I know." Something shadowed his expression briefly before disappearing again beneath restraint. But difficult things are not impossible. Around them, noble couples continued circling the ballroom, while whispered conversation drifted like smoke through the air. Yet Vivian barely noticed anyone beyond. Cedric. Dancing with him felt strangely unlike dancing at all. More like existing inside a moment untouched by judgment for the first time in her life. Cedric guided her effortlessly across polished marble floors beneath crystal light and falling snow beyond the tall windows. "You are quieter tonight," he observed softly after several moments. Vivian hesitated. "My father spoke with me yesterday." Something sharpened subtly behind Cedric's gaze. And she looked away briefly. He said softness is dangerous. Silence lingered between them for several heartbeats. Then Cedric said quietly, "Only to cruel people." The words settled deep inside her chest. Dangerous in their gentleness. Because no one had ever defended softness before. Not around her. Not within her. Across the ballroom, Vivian noticed several noble women openly observing them now, while Clarissa stood near the staircase with visible frustration. Eleanor Hale remained composed, though tension pulled tightly beneath her practiced smile each time another guest glanced toward the dance floor. Society understood what this moment meant. Cedric Ashbourne was not simply being polite anymore. He was choosing her publicly. The realization terrified Vivian almost as much as it warmed her. "Your Grace," she whispered carefully. "People will misunderstand." Cedric's expression remained calm. "People misunderstand many things." His hand tightened slightly against hers as the music slowed. "That has never stopped me before." Vivian's heart stumbled painfully at the quiet promise hidden beneath the words. Then suddenly the orchestra faltered mid-note. The music stopped completely. Confused murmurs rippled through the ballroom as every head turned toward the grand entrance. A servant hurried breathlessly across the marble floor before bowing deeply before Cedric. "Your Grace," he said urgently, "forgive the interruption, but Lady Whitmore has arrived unexpectedly." Cedric's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. Vivian felt the shift instantly. "She insists upon speaking with you privately." A strange stillness settled over Cedric's face then. Cold, controlled, familiar somehow. For the first time that evening, he released Vivian's hand. The warmth vanished the moment Cedric released her hand. Vivian felt it instantly. The sudden distance. The return of cold air against skin that moments earlier still carried the memory of his touch. Around them, the ballroom stirred with renewed whispers as guests turned curiously toward the entrance hall, where Lady Whitmore now stood beneath the towering archway. Vivian recognized her immediately. Everyone in Blackthorn County did. Lady Amelia Whitmore possessed the kind of beauty society admired without question. Tall, elegant, perfectly composed beneath layers of deep crimson silk and diamonds that glittered like frost beneath chandelier light. Rumors had linked her name to Cedric Ashbourne for years. Some claimed their engagement had once been nearly arranged before Cedric withdrew from society after his brother's death. Others whispered that Lady Whitmore still intended to become Duchess of Ashbourne one day. And now she stood inside his ballroom, looking directly at Vivian with unmistakable displeasure. "Cedric," Amelia said smoothly while approaching across the marble floor. Her voice carried just enough warmth to appear intimate. "Forgive the interruption. The weather delayed my arrival." Cedric's expression remained unreadable once more. Lady Whitmore. No warmth. No visible affection. Yet Vivian still stepped backward instinctively. The old fear returned immediately. Of course someone like Amelia belonged beside a man like Cedric. Elegant women with confident smiles and practiced grace. Not frightened girls who apologized for breathing too loudly. Vivian lowered her gaze before anyone could read the humiliation suddenly rising inside her chest. Foolish. She had been foolish to forget herself even briefly. "Miss Hale." Amelia's attention shifted toward her politely enough, though something cold lingered beneath the smile. "I believe congratulations are in order. Your performance at the recital has become quite the subject of discussion." Vivian forced herself to answer softly. "Thank you. How fortunate," Amelia continued delicately, "that the Duke enjoys discovering hidden talents." The meaning beneath the words landed clearly enough. Temporary, novel, easily forgotten. Cedric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly beside them. "Lady Whitmore," he said calmly, "you requested a private conversation." Amelia turned toward him at once. "Yes, about your decision regarding the Winter Foundation." A flicker of annoyance crossed Cedric's features before disappearing beneath restraint. "This is hardly the place." "Then perhaps we should speak elsewhere." The invitation beneath her tone felt unmistakable. Nearby guests pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Vivian's pulse tightened painfully. This was the world she had always feared. Beautiful people speaking elegantly while quietly reminding others they did not belong. She stepped backward another inch. "Please excuse me." Cedric turned instantly toward her. "Miss Hale." But Vivian lowered her eyes quickly before he could continue. "I should return to my family." Without waiting for permission, she slipped away through the crowded ballroom while the orchestra resumed softly behind her. Snowstorm winds rattled faintly against the tall windows as she moved through glittering guests and candlelight toward the quieter corridors beyond the grand staircase. Her chest ached in ways she did not fully understand. Not jealousy exactly. Worse perhaps, disappointment in herself for hoping at all. Vivian wandered blindly through Ashbourne Manor until distant music faded almost entirely behind thick stone walls and darkened hallways lit only by scattered candle sconces. She finally stopped beside a narrow balcony overlooking the snow-covered gardens below. Outside, white snow drifted endlessly across frozen hedges and silent fountains beneath the midnight sky. Vivian pressed trembling fingers against the cold marble railing and closed her eyes. "There you are." Cedric's voice behind her shattered the silence instantly. Vivian stiffened but did not turn around. "Your Grace should not leave his guests unattended." Footsteps approached slowly across the stone floor. "I was not concerned about my guests." The honesty inside the words weakened something painfully guarded inside her chest. Vivian swallowed softly. "Lady Whitmore seemed upset by my presence." Cedric stopped beside her overlooking the snowy gardens below. "Lady Whitmore is upset by many things." Despite herself, Vivian glanced toward him briefly. Candlelight flickered softly across his sharp features, while winter shadows lingered in his gray eyes. "People are talking tonight," she whispered carefully. "They will create stories." Cedric looked toward the falling snow beyond the balcony. "Society creates stories whenever something challenges its expectations." Then his gaze returned steadily to hers. "And you, Vivian Hale, have challenged them far more than you realize." Her breath caught softly at the sound of her name spoken so gently beneath the quiet winter night. For one dangerous moment, the entire world beyond the balcony disappeared again, until voices suddenly echoed from the corridor behind them. "I saw them come this way." Clarissa. Clarissa appeared first beneath the dim corridor candlelight, her dark green gown sweeping sharply across the stone floor as she stopped at the entrance to the balcony. Eleanor Hale followed only seconds later, her composed expression strained by barely concealed alarm. Both women froze the instant they saw Vivian standing beside Cedric Ashbourne alone against the backdrop of falling snow and midnight shadows. Silence settled heavily over the balcony. Even the winter wind seemed to quiet itself. Clarissa recovered first. "There you are," she said lightly, though tension sharpened every word. "Mother was concerned you had wandered off." Vivian instinctively stepped backward from Cedric at once. The old reflex returned before she could stop it. "Make yourself smaller. Less noticeable. Safer." But Cedric noticed the movement immediately. His expression darkened almost imperceptibly beneath the candlelight. Eleanor approached slowly with practiced elegance. "Your Grace," she said smoothly, "forgive the interruption. I fear my daughter occasionally forgets propriety when overwhelmed." Vivian lowered her eyes instantly, shame tightening painfully inside her chest. Yet before she could apologize, Cedric spoke in a voice calm enough to silence the corridor entirely. "I invited Miss Hale here." Eleanor faltered slightly. "Of course. Naturally." "Still, appearances, Cedric interrupted quietly, "seem to concern everyone except the people behaving cruelly behind them." The words landed softly, yet Clarissa stiffened immediately. Eleanor's composure cracked for the briefest moment. Vivian stared at Cedric in stunned silence. No one had ever defended her publicly against her family before. Not once in her life. The realization shook something deep inside her. Clarissa crossed her arms tightly. "You speak as though we mistreated her." Cedric's gray eyes moved toward her with terrifying calm. "Did you not?" The question lingered unanswered beneath the flickering candlelight, because suddenly the silence itself became revealing. Eleanor inhaled carefully before forcing another controlled smile. "Vivian has always been sensitive." Cedric looked toward Vivian then. Truly looked at her. "Sensitive people notice things others spend their lives ignoring." His voice softened slightly. "That is not weakness." Vivian felt her throat tighten painfully. Every cruel lesson from childhood seemed to collide violently against the quiet certainty in his words. Weak. Difficult. Too emotional. Too fragile. She had heard those judgments her entire life until they became part of her identity. Yet Cedric spoke as though softness itself possessed value, as though gentleness deserved protection instead of shame. Clarissa gave a quiet, incredulous laugh. "Your Grace barely knows her." Cedric's gaze never left Vivian. "No," he said quietly. "I simply listened when she spoke." The truth of the statement shattered something inside her completely. Vivian suddenly realized no one in her family had ever truly listened at all. They corrected her, managed her, silenced her. But listening required believing her thoughts mattered enough to hear. Tears burned unexpectedly behind her eyes. She turned away quickly, embarrassed by the emotion rising too fast to control. Vivian. Cedric's voice softened further at her name. Look at me. Slowly she did. Snow drifted beyond the balcony behind him while candlelight flickered across the sharp lines of his face. Yet for the first time since meeting him, Cedric Ashbourne no longer looked cold to her. He looked careful with her heart. You do not need permission to exist loudly enough for the world to hear you, he said quietly. The words settled into the deepest, wounded corners of her soul with painful gentleness. Vivian felt tears finally slip free despite every desperate effort to stop them. Not from humiliation this time. Relief. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably beside Clarissa, clearly unsettled by the intimacy of the moment unfolding before them. Because they understood now what society would soon understand as well. Cedric Ashbourne was not rescuing Vivian from embarrassment. He was teaching her she had never deserved it. Slowly, almost trembling, Vivian lifted her chin for the first time in years without apology attached to the movement. The winter wind curled softly through the balcony while snow covered the dark world below Ashbourne Manor in white silence. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, Vivian Hale realized her voice had never truly been lost. Only buried beneath years of fear waiting for someone kind enough to help her believe it deserved to be heard.